James Clapper. Well, actually, when was this? It was this year, right?
This was this year,
This
yeah.
year. Making a statement about how IoT is going to be beneficial for surveillance.
So this was in direct testimony submitted to the Senate. In the future, intelligence services might use the Internet of Things for identification, surveillance, monitoring, location tracking, and targeting for recruitment, or to gain access to networks or user credentials.
So I think that what we're looking at is here kind of an expanding, I guess, a wealth of devices that haven't been available in the past. You know, the fight this year has been about the Apple iPhone. And obviously computers are another target, and now we have to widen this to the Internet of Things and all the other available targets that are going to be beneficial to surveillance. So I want to actually just sort of start by asking the panelists not to define IoT, but tell us maybe in your minds, like, what are the most surprising IoT things that we might not think of as IoT that could be used for surveillance? Broaden our minds here of our understanding that it's more than refrigerators, more than toasters, even maybe more than cars. What are the things that are the most surprising IoT that we might not think about, and the ways that they might be surveilled?
So, I mean, I think it's hard to draw a line between what is IoT and what is not IoT. I think for me, my definition is in many ways focused on in some ways, the form factor and the lower capabilities. So the smarts of the computer in question are smaller, usually don't have a dedicated display. And I think that we can think of smartphones as sort of the prototypes of IoT. And in many ways, we can expect that all of the capabilities that we see in our smartphones today to migrate smaller and smaller, lose their displays, and get embedded into all sorts of devices. I think we see this trend exemplified by the wearable trend. So we see, smartwatches. We see sensors being put into shoes. Eventually, I'm sure we're going to see, Google Glass was canceled, but I'm sure that we're going to see other wearable form factors that are either going to serve as essentially phones themselves, or that are going to connect to the phones, the more capable phones that we carry in our pockets. So for me, I think that in many ways, the IoT, the surprising direction of it, is not things that are embedded in devices that are static, but that we carry around with us all the time.
And so you're suggesting that what we might currently have as an IoT device, that single feature, are going to be broadened to have more capability.
They're going to have more capability, and I think they're also going to, one of the really interesting challenges or problems that we might see down the road is that these devices are going to network with one another. So if they're devices that are being developed by big tech companies that own several different IoT sort of markets, they might be networked together. You might see collaboration in their privacy policies and their data exchange, or you might even see collaborations across companies. So you have, one company that focuses on athletics and, have sensors for shoes and a smartphone app, and then another company, that is looking at your car and sort of trying to understand something about the way that your running habits integrate with your car, and they find some niche way to try and monetize that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anything with an addressable sensor is things that we need to start thinking about. I saw an internet-connected wine bottle yesterday, which that doesn't even make sense. Like, why are we putting this shit on the internet? Seriously, why? Why are we putting wine bottles on the internet? Amazon Dash is interesting, right? Because Amazon Dash, they're these little single-purpose buttons. You can buy a button from Amazon, and you stick it to your washing machine, and the button has the Tide logo. And when you run out of detergent, you press the button, and that orders Tide for you. But think about what that means. That button has at least one sensor and at least one radio in it. And so, great. Now you have a sensor and a radio put somewhere where there's just no business having a sensor and a radio. The connecting of, or the addition of connectivity to sensors is something that we need to start thinking about in a way that most engineers haven't thought about. As we were talking on the up here a little bit before we started, about cars are one of the most obvious IoT vectors that we have right now, because Andy Greenberg was almost killed by our friends last summer. It was a funny hack, haha, scared the crap out of Andy. But why are companies putting network addressable radios on a sensor bus that was not designed with any security, any authentication, anything like that? I'm trying to, you'll see me looking down at my phone. I'm not checking my email. I'm trying to find a quote from Judge Orenstein, which I hope to find, so I'm not going to spoil it.
Um, so Internet of Things, I come from a country where all those features I am hearing about are not already there. But how I see it is like the Internet of Things market is controlled by companies who only look to provide features, and the least of things they think about is the privacy of the users, or how the data is being transferred. Is it transferred in a secure way? And those are the things I am most afraid about.
So in terms of like the capabilities of the Internet of Things or on these devices now, can you give us an example of the kind of data you started to touch on it, the kind of data that we should be concerned about, the kind of information that we should be concerned about that they can get, and not necessarily your future device that has more capability, but why should I care about a device that's just going to tell someone how much I walked today, or so? And I understand the concern when you start combining all of this data. But just in terms of my physical fitness with a Fitbit or something like that, what are the capabilities here in terms of surveillance? And not just, I'm with the understanding that this isn't just going to be government surveillance. It's going to be insurance company surveillance, other things. Yeah.
So one of the examples I heard once in, I think it was in the World Social Forum, is those little sensors like the Fitbit that would know how many steps you would make a day, and I think a health insurance company would be very interested to know if you are a lazy person or not, and that would conditionate the money you would like pay every month for your health insurance. Those are examples of data that can be exploited not only by those companies, but also the fact that the data are not sent in a secure way from the sensors to the command and control center. So anyone can sniff those data, not only the company who is using that feature, but also anyone that is sniffing the traffic. Or so, as I told you in the beginning, occurred with smartphones. So smartphones were thought to be only about features, and it were never designed to be secure. So this is the big issue.
So I have a couple of thoughts. One is on Fitbit. So for the record, I love Fitbit. I wear a Fitbit every day. I have, friends who work at the company, and so I'm a big fan of theirs. But I remember several years ago, they had a bit of a scandal because you can actually categorize your activity and sort of mark your activity from, span to span on your Fitbit dashboard. If I remember correctly, what ended up happening is that someone realized that they could go through and see when people were having sex. Because sexual activity was one of the physical activities that not was necessarily recognized by the platform per se, but that you could sort of program in. And so you could go in and you could essentially tell how often your neighbors were having sex if you were Fitbit friends with them. And so that's not an example of something necessarily that is going to be surveillance oriented, that the government is really going to use against you in any way, but is certainly something that's very embarrassing.
I could actually see a government use for that.
Yeah. Oh, wow. To repeat, there was apparently a case last summer of Fitbit being used to disprove an alleged rape. So that is something that we can certainly see it being used in all sorts of innovative ways, for better or for worse in legal situations. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I think, one of the big challenges for a lot of IoT devices is that the interface, the way that the human being, the user actually interacts with it, can be very limited. And one very trendy, very popular way to get around this is through voice interaction. And so, instead of having to go and, I actually worked when I was in the tech industry on one of the very early wearable platforms that eventually now is shipped and is used, which is really great. But I remember talking to the designers, they were all about voice because they hated the idea of having people fiddle around with the stuff on their wrist. They're like, no, 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 you're going to talk to your watch. You're going to talk to your watch. That's how we're going to get everything done. We're going to talk to our watches and it's going to be wonderful, except now our watch is listening to us. And if your watch is listening to you for certain commands, all it takes is a quick software update and your watch is listening to you for other commands and other words and other phrases. And as voice recognition gets better in our ability, or the tech companies or the government's ability to listen in for certain keywords or listen in for certain phrases, that sensor being embedded in your life is going to be more and more problematic.
I'm actually curious about another element of that, though, not listening in, but sort of voice. What's it called when you're identifying a voice? There's actually a word that I'm thinking of, but maybe voice recognition. But actually, there's another term. And I'm wondering about, we have bulk surveillance now with emails and metadata and things like that. Could you conceivably see, and I don't know what the legal limits of this are, could you see the government getting a bulk collection of stored voice data in order to run through and try and identify someone that way? They have a recording of someone, they don't know who it is. They go to a company like Fitbit or somewhere else that has a repository of voice recordings, and then try and identify and match that voice.
Well, I mean, now that you've given them the
idea.
idea, yeah, I can definitely see it happening.
Well done.
Thanks, Kim.
Is that legal? I mean, I suppose it would be.
Well, I mean, I can think of a lot of reasons why it might not be, but I can also see a lot of courts rejecting all of those reasons. So let me talk a little bit about the legal landscape of IoT and surveillance. So there's a case called InRay the company from a number of years ago, and we think it's OnStar, the company. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was a company that provided emergency voice services to automakers, so that if you got in a car crash, your car would automatically dial 911 for you, things like that. I think OnStar was the only company providing that service at the time, so we think InRay the company is regarding OnStar. Anyway, the FBI had gotten a wiretap order, and gotten an order from a court directing OnStar to turn a particular car's OnStar system into a bug, into a listening device, because they wanted to wiretap let's call it, this is the United States, so it was probably a drug dealer. So I don't actually remember that, but let's pretend it was a drug dealer. OnStar fought back and ended up winning at the circuit court level. And the reason, and here's the problem with this case. It's a great case. We cite it all the time at EFF. But the problem is, the reason OnStar won was because at the time, in old school cell phone days, there was no data. It was just analog voice. I think this was 1G cell phone essentially. Or even before that, it might have been amps. Who knows? So the only way that this wiretap could work, it would tie up the phone line, and that would disable the actual emergency service. So if this drug dealer had gotten in a car crash while the wiretap was active, OnStar wouldn't have been able to dial 911 because it would instead be broadcasting back to the FBI. And OnStar fought and won on the theory that this wiretap order would have eliminated the capability of the system to function as was intended. Contrast that with Ford Sync. Ford Sync is Ford's in-dash infotainment system, weather, traffic, news, who knows what you can do in your car these days. In Ford Sync's terms of service, when you click accept, when you buy the car and turn on Ford Sync for the first time, what you're accepting is a term that says Ford is allowed to record everything you say to the system, and everything else that's happening in the car when you use the system, when you're dictating text messages or emails or doing voice searches for restaurants or voice searches for, for whatever, gas stations, whatever you happen to be, medical marijuana dispensaries, whatever you happen to be searching for in your car, all of that goes back to Ford. Ford gets to keep it forever and share it with its partners for the improvement of the service, whatever that means. So contrast late 90s, early 2000s on the OnStar case with now, when you get in your Ford, you've agreed to Ford listening to everything that you say, and presumably sharing that with anyone who sends legal process. That's what the Internet of Things has given us. The Internet of Things has given us, listening devices in everything.
Are the conversations recorded, or is it just?
So the conversations are not recorded on board the car, but they are. So they're not recorded until you press the button. But as soon as you press the button on Ford Sync, everything that you say and everything that your passengers say goes back to Ford and its service providers and its third-party partners.
And it is stored then.
And it is stored, presumably, for as long as they have storage space.
So, I mean, it doesn't sound like I'm... oh, by the way, we have a questions system. I guess I need to mention that if you guys have questions, you can be sending, but I don't know exactly what you're sending to.
You go to slido.com and you can join. I think you enter the cottage as your thing.
There's a question.
Oh, and then we get questions.
But also, I can. If you raise your hand, I'll just call it on you as well. If you don't want to do the hassle of that, because they're probably collecting data about you. Okay. So one other thing that I wanted to address, and then I will go to some questions, is with the Internet of Things, the issue of security. Obviously, surveillance, when we see with the Apple phone, if you've got vulnerabilities in these devices, the government and intelligence agencies are going to be using those vulnerabilities to get into them and conduct surveillance. But when we have IoT devices, these are companies that don't consider themselves software companies and aren't in the habit of doing over-the-air updates, which we saw with the cars already. And that's going to be a problem across the board with IoT companies that aren't used to, they don't have bug bounty programs, first of all. And so they may not even know about the vulnerabilities, but even if they do, can they update them? And I just want to point out that we already have this problem even with phones. I mean, if you have now vulnerabilities found in phones, despite, what if Google has a bug bounty program, Apple doesn't. But also, if you have baseband problems, they don't get updated. You do not get an update to your phone unless the hardware maker decides to distribute that, and they don't. Maybe once a year.
Can I say something very briefly
Yes.
there? I think so. I actually used to work in the Android ecosystem, and something that you see is that there's sort of an inverse relationship between the value of the device and the motivation of the manufacturer to update it. So if you are a manufacturer that specializes in low-value devices, $40 phones, $5 sensors, something like that, your business model is built around people disposing them and buying new ones on a regular basis. So your motivation to update them is very small. Whereas if you're Apple and you have $600 devices, you expect that people are going to keep them for several years and be more motivated to update them. But even then, they've got a half-life. There's a certain point at which your value to you as an organization to continue updating them goes downhill and you just stop doing it. But I think that that's very important to remember, that relationship as we get into an IoT world. The lower value, less expensive sensors are going to be less likely to be updated quickly.
Yeah, important. Mohammed, did you want to talk about that at all? You want to pass? Okay, so we do have one question here. Sorry, we need a mic. Oh no, actually this is over this. So is it possible to connect Bluetooth low energy device not in pairing mode, or does someone need access to the device to hack it?
I can try.
Okay.
So the short answer, I believe, is that it depends. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Bluetooth Low Energy,
I was the lawyer.
Bluetooth Low Energy is a new-ish standard, or a new-ish sort of part of the Bluetooth standard that was designed specifically for sensor devices. So the idea is that traditional Bluetooth is used for headsets, things where you're streaming data, things where you have sort of a consistent, stream of data that's going by. higher bandwidth, etc. Audio is sort of the canonical use case for traditional Bluetooth. Bluetooth Low Energy, in contrast, is designed for sporadic updates, very sort of rare, periodic, designed for sensors, things in your shoes, stuff like that. Now, the trick is that the way in which Bluetooth Low Energy is being used is determined in part by the ecosystem in which it exists. So iPhones were the first, they were before Android in adopting Bluetooth Low Energy. And on an iPhone, as I understand it, this may have changed in the past couple of years, but you could not actually create a custom use for Bluetooth on the iPhone. You could, however, create a custom use for Bluetooth Low Energy on the iPhone. And so that meant that you saw things like pool cleaning robots, literally pool cleaning robots, that were using Bluetooth Low Energy on the iPhone because they could create a custom app for it. So the short answer is that maybe not, but it, independent of what you're supposed to do according to the standard, you see people doing all sorts of fascinating things with Bluetooth Low Energy outside of the standard for their individual apps. So I am sure that even if the standard says that it shouldn't be possible to connect to a Bluetooth Low Energy device outside of pairing mode, there are definitely devices out on the market today that you can connect to outside of pairing mode and do all sorts of crazy things with.
I mean, I think it's safe to say that if the radio is on, it can probably, a determined adversary can probably find a way in. If the radio is off, that's it, right? If the actual radio hardware is not powered, then you can't hack it. Otherwise, I don't think we can say with any confidence that we can't say the answer is no if the radio is on.
Are there any other questions in the room before I go to the next one that's in here? If anyone wants to not use that. Okay. So, we got two now. Are there Are there development kits or best practice guides for IoT builders you'd recommend for user security? This leads us to a question that I had in terms of what do we have in terms of base security right now in IoT? One of the problems that we see, and maybe I'll just throw that out to you, what are the base problems that you're seeing in IoT? Lack of encryption you were talking about the stream of communication and things like that, lack of authentication. Why don't we talk about that first and then go into what, for developers, what they should be doing. So what is the baseline of security that we have for most IoT at this point? And what are the main problems that you see?
Some facility for user control. So that includes providing some facility for the user to understand what data is being gathered, what is being done with that data, and some capacity to either stop the data being gathered and or some capacity to remove the data that has been gathered in the past. This is one of the big challenges of IoT. We see a lot of devices, it's seamless. You just put it on your wall and it works. And you don't ever have to really interact with it. That's great, except that it prevents the user from going and understanding what data is being gathered. This is a best practice and I think that this is going to be a theme in IoT. IoT is not that special. I mean, it's just another computer. It's just another cloud service provider that's gathering a bunch of data and doing interesting things with it. So all of the same principles around transparency to the users about what the data is being collected, what's being done with it, and some capacity to permanently remove that data from the service provider, I think is really important.
And in terms of other problems that you see with the security of IoT?
I'm very fan of open source software and open source hardware, and I don't see any OTI software or Internet of Things software or Internet of Things hardware being open sourced until now. And this means, for me, open source means that it respects the data of the users and it's transparent, basically. And what I can see is closed source, and no one knows really what it is doing and where are the data sent and what are we doing with the data.
So in terms of any other advice for developers, is there
I don't know. If you add network connectivity to something, assume that it's going to be compromised and design the way that it connects to the rest of the system with that assumption. Like if you're designing a Bluetooth addressable driving app that you plug into your OBD2 port in your car to monitor your fuel consumption and your acceleration and stuff like that. If you're making that network addressable, assume that you're going to get malicious commands on the network. So think about what that means. If you're connecting it to the OBD2, what are you giving access to? If you're putting your fridge on the internet, what are you giving access to? If you put your implanted defibrillator on the internet, what are you potentially giving access to? Right? Dick Cheney had the wireless radio on his defibrillator removed before it was implanted in him because he was afraid of assassination attempts using his defibrillator. So he had that disabled. Everyone else in the world, everyone else in the world.
Right. No one else has that option.
Okay, everyone else in the world can potentially be killed in the way that Dick Cheney can't.
Well, there are other ways of doing it.
Well, yeah, right. Dick Cheney doesn't have that vuln that everybody else does. He might have other vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing when I sort of laid it out in the beginning, like what are the IoT devices that we're not talking about, and medical devices. I think it's something that a lot of people aren't putting into this category. I mean, the focus is on cars right now, but I really think that medical devices aren't getting the attention that they need, and the risks there are that you have a lot of medical devices that are connected to hospital networks that themselves aren't secure. So I guess I want to come back to this question, though, again, about the security. What I see is the size of the chips don't provide the capability for adding authentication. And so, and you guys can speak to this, I'll just throw this out as a comment, that what I see over and over again is, sure, they'd like to add authentication, but they don't even have space for authentication. And so we're talking about re-architecting things that you've got a company that's a startup. And how do you get this without legislation, without any kind of regulation? How do you fix that kind of issue where it's not a patch issue, it's a re-architecting issue?
I mean, I think the way that it's going to get fixed is there's going to be a disaster, and people are going to react to it. As we were talking about earlier, most IoT sensors and even the computers are super low value. They're being designed by by companies who don't have security engineers. And so what the quote that I was looking for, which I couldn't find in Judge Ornstein's order in New York from last month, is the Internet of Things is a nightmare scenario when it comes to surveillance. Those were the words that Ornstein used. In terms of how are we going to fix that? I think we're going to see that nightmare come true before anyone cares enough to fix it. I don't know, do you just?
I mean, I think it's kind of scary, but think about how long it took for Microsoft to get really serious about security. And I think that, we take that problem, and I mean, happily, we've got more domain knowledge. We have more people who have security training that, these startups could go and hire. But, so the process might be sped up a little bit. It might not take decades. But still, you're going to have this problem over and over and over again with your light bulbs and with your thermostats and with your refrigerators and with your cars and with your insulin pump and with your defibrillator. It's going to happen over and over and over again. So I think, I don't know if there's some better business bureau for data security policy that we can create that will, be anything other than just a sticker that someone puts on their website. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really hard problem.
What's Mudge's thing at Cyber UL?
That would be, he's starting a lab, which would be like what we have for toasters and everything now. What's the underwriters lab?
Laboratory, UL, yeah.
So he wants to do an underwriters laboratory for software, but I really don't see how that's going to work. But
I mean, it's a great idea.
It's very ambitious.
Very ambitious.
No doubt.
And if you can combine that with Dan Gear saying there should be liability for bad software, then
Well,
maybe
that's
we're
a
going
really
somewhere.
that's a really big question, you know, and I am not a lawyer, so I cannot even hypothesize, but could someone you know, have some sort of case that they could build if they discovered that their data was being leaked down the road by their light bulbs?
So yes, so lawyer answer, it depends. If you can show, so right now you have to be able to show actual monetary damages that are directly related to that. So if you could show, you know, let me put my class action lawyer hat on. If you could show that your light bulbs were being hacked and that was costing every consumer a fraction of a cent in terms of extra power, then maybe there's a class action. But it's not ideal, right? Once we start talking about legal standards in hardware and software, we get into the South Korea scenario. So in South Korea, they have pretty stringent requirements for financial systems. What that means is that to this day, a majority of ATMs in South Korea run Windows XP. Not Vista, not 7, XP. That's terrifying to me. The fact that ATMs would be running XP to this day. And the reason that they do so is because it was certified. XP was certified by whatever government regulator there who was in charge of certifications back in 2001. And because certifications are so expensive and so time-consuming, XP was the last version of Windows to get certified for this. And XP is Microsoft dropped support for it like 5 years ago. So yeah, it's possible to combine CyberUL or something like that with liability, but it could backfire big time.
So we have another legal question. What is the legal status of IoT data if private party wants to access it under a civil court action such as a divorce or insurance fraud investigation? That already happens, but why don't you address that?
Yeah. So in terms of legal protections of IoT data, the world is relatively confused here. The legal landscape is very much undeveloped. The only area where we have really good protections is in actual communications. So content of communications can't, with some exceptions, can't really be accessed in a civil court proceeding, sort of full stop. But most IoT is not content of communications. There's maybe some of it is, but most of it is not. You know, sensor data that isn't voice recognition, you're going to be able to get, period.
Why is there a distinction there between?
The distinction comes from Warshak, reasonable expectation of privacy. We have very good case law that says the content of communication, that we have a reasonable expectation of privacy in the content of our communications and not in data surrounding it. So like black box data from a car can be accessed with a mere subpoena in, I think, all 50 states. And certainly in the federal system, there's no protection at all.
But not if it's your car. You can't access your own data, but you could.
Well,
if you're an insurance company, you can subpoena and get that data.
Right. You know, if you're in a crash and there's a lawsuit surrounding it, you can probably get your own data, but not without that. Mm-hmm. So legal status of IoT data, yeah, it's fair game.
Okay. Regarding health medical devices that connect and upload data, can we implement security at both the device level and the cloud database level in one swoop?
So in a technical sense, I mean, yes and no, not to be a lawyer about it. But sure, if you have a company, a tech company, or, you know, a startup or whatever that is really motivated to make sure that their medical devices are truly secure as to the best of their ability, they can absolutely try and, you know, make sure that things are secure on the device side and the way that the radios are managed, and that, you know, there's some sort of authentication that happens, and at the cloud database level. In reality, if you look at the number of organizations that are able to hire security engineers and the sort of broad diversity of expertise that's going to be necessary to properly secure both an embedded device like an insulin pump or a defibrillator and also the cloud database, that you're not talking one person. Usually you're talking multiple security engineers. And so if you're a small startup or a sort of specialized company, you're trying to hire, a couple security people. Are you going to be able to get someone with the diversity of skills to be able to do a sort of a true end-to-end, hardening? It seems less probable, which is really scary. But yes, certainly there's nothing technical, or legal or policy that would prevent it from all being done at once. But the sort of practical, challenges around the skill set necessary to do so, that's hard.
So back to another legal question then. Should IoT data stored online be subject to legal removal requests from users? For example, is it copyrightable? So this is an interesting issue because, what you were talking about in terms of you should have that ability to say or to know what kind of data is being collected from your device and to be able to configure and limit that. But we have the third-party doctrine that says that data that you give to a company doesn't belong to you, and that's, I don't know if any of you were in Senator Wyden's talk this afternoon where he addressed the difficulties around the third-party doctrine that says that if you're giving up data, it's no longer yours. And we also have, interestingly, we have Apple making a statement that your data on your phone is yours, and we don't want to get into it, we don't own it, it's yours. And then you have something like Facebook that says if you are going to make posts on here, we control this content and we can do things. So where are we with Internet of Data things and in anything, actually? It seems like we've got a lot of mix here.
Well, so I'll answer the second part of the question first. Most IoT data is not going to be copyrightable. Copyright requires expression. So sensor data on the acceleration of a car is not expressive, so there is going to be no copyright to it. Even surveillance, like video footage, is probably not going to be copyrightable if it's just recording what's happening. Maybe some voice recognition stuff is copyrightable, but it's not even a good case. So no, you're not going to get DMCA takedowns for IoT data. Subject to legal removal requests. The answer in Europe is probably vastly different than the answer in the States. In the States, everything is going to be controlled by contract. And by contract, I mean terms of service. So if you have agreed to give Facebook a non-exclusive, perpetual, non-revocable license to your IoT data, then no, there's nothing you can do about it. Facebook was probably the wrong example. I was just using them because of you. If you're giving Nest and thereby Google a perpetual, non-revocable, non-exclusive license to your data, then no, there's nothing you can do legally to claw that data back.
What about the issue, though? The whole terms of service thing really aggravates me because you have a one-sided contract, essentially. I mean, you're saying if you agree to, in most cases, people aren't reading the terms of service. But what also worries me is that you have privacy agreements that change all the time, and there doesn't seem to be proper notice to you that what you agreed to yesterday has now changed, and if you continue to use this service, then you're agreeing to this new thing. So you can agree with your Internet IoT data, it's fine, you can collect this, and then tomorrow you don't realize that actually they're collecting more. What are the rights for users in that sense? I mean, are there absolutely no rights in terms of how those terms of service can just change willy-nilly?
The case law is really bad on this. I would love it if there were rights. EFF has been looking for a case to challenge this for a long time. But right now the case law is really bad in terms of service. So even if we got the protections that you're saying, even if you had that ability to say don't collect this data, they can basically just on their own one-sided tomorrow say it doesn't matter what you've specified.
Well, they might bury it in a change of terms of service. Right. I mean, there's what the contract as you understand it, and then there's the contract that's actually written out in 8-point font, 13 lines down. Right.
I mean, I would argue that a change of that nature is so drastic that it would be unconscionable. The case law supporting me there.
Right, unconscionable and legal are two different things.
The question is, wouldn't the FTC get involved? The FTC could get involved, but they are a very small staff that has a whole lot on their docket.
question that just disappeared that I was about to, the nightmares.
It went down for some reason.
Someone voted it down.
Oh, is that what's happening here? You all are killing each other?
Down vote.
So do you want to take it from the top?
We've already sort of answered that one in terms of
Whether there are any open source efforts to come up with alternative servers for any IoT devices.
what do you mean servers? Alternative servers.
So I'm assuming they mean cloud services. Short answer for me, and maybe Mohammed has some more insight into this, I don't know of any off the top of my head. I would be really surprised if there wasn't anything on Sandstorm that was designed to sort of interface with an IoT device of some sort. And my understanding of the Sandstorm community is that if you went there and had some interest in building something in this space, that you could probably find some other folks who were interested in supporting you. But I don't know of any off the top of my head otherwise.
Yes.
This is sort of goes with the idea of controlling the data, but the question is about proposing a balance between allowing user access to access code on devices they own and preventing malicious hacking. Yeah, I mean, this is a problem also. This was an issue with black boxes where company or customers, car owners, wanted to see how black boxes were collecting data because it's being used in civil cases and by insurance companies against them. And there have been people who wanted to see, they wanted to see the accuracy. Is it actually true when the black box records that you're speeding? Is it actually true when it records that you weren't wearing a seatbelt? And users don't have that ability because they don't have, they can't get into this proprietary system. I'm trying to figure out other scenarios where that's a real issue, having access to that code in IoT devices besides cars.
There's a fairly serious issue with repairing devices. John Deere's been involved in litigation in the last year. Oh, sure. There's a very serious issue with repairing devices that contain code. John Deere, the tractor company, has been involved in litigation recently, claiming copyright in all of the code within their tractors, which means that if you are a farmer and you own the tractor you paid $150,000 for, you're not allowed to repair it.
So you have to go to an authorized repairman
Correct,
to do.
because they won't. Their claim is that granting access to their copyrighted code and you reproducing it for purposes of repair, et cetera, is a Section 1201 violation. And so this has been extremely controversial, but the more devices that we have on our persons, cars, et cetera, that have code, likely proprietary, you mentioned the defibrillator. I would kind of like to know if my insulin pump's code is secure, hackable, et cetera. You know,
It's not.
right, but I don't know that.
And that's where something like
You want
the
the ability.
proposed work that Mudge is doing around trying to verify the code would be really compelling, because I think the tricky part is that the average user, I mean I've got a background in computer security, but that doesn't actually mean that I'm really qualified to go read my car software and really understand what it's saying. So for me, I don't know. I am a huge proponent of open source software. I think it's really critical for our community, for our world. But at the same time, open source doesn't always necessarily, in all cases, absolutely have to maybe mean that every person gets access to it. Maybe there are some types of code, especially in really, really critical applications where you have respected third parties that are doing the software reviews. I don't know. That's a one rough idea.
So I would push back on the premise of the question a little bit. The way that I read it, there's a sort of unspoken premise here, which is that that allowing access to the code would potentially facilitate malicious hacking. I don't think that's at all true. We have not seen that open source projects are any less secure than closed source projects, and maybe we've seen the exact opposite in a lot of cases.
Right.
So there is no balance to find. We can have both.
Just on the vehicle side, I work at Motor Power Systems, a company that
He's on.
Hello? Oh, this is loud now. On the vehicle side, I think there's a different challenge, though, because I work at Motive Power Systems. We're medium, heavy-duty size powertrains for electric vehicles. And in the U.S., when you build a vehicle, vehicles aren't inspected by alternative parties. It's a self-certification where everything you do, you have to certify meets the federal motor vehicle safety standards. One of the risks is that if somebody else can use your code and then the code screws up, are you, the company who owns the device, going to be held liable for your users changing the code? And that's a very real concern a lot of companies have in terms of, in the same way, if you use an aftermarket device, the California Air Resources Board has to let you do that.
But why is that different from me fixing my car and causing something mechanically that causes the car to crash? They're not liable for that. Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't. So the comment was because it's networked. That doesn't change the liability structure at all.
Oh, that someone else can get into it.
That doesn't change the liability structure.
But the concern for a lot of people on the vehicle side is if you open this up and say, okay, users can change their data, and you give permission for that, if they change it in a way that you don't intend, are you going to potentially be held for that? Because right now it's such a moving target on how software in vehicles is regulated at all, where in the same way that software is not really regulated, but in certain segments, so healthcare devices, you have to do FDA testing in a very specific way. Any change...
Unfortunately, not about the security of the device, though.
Not about the security of the device, but the problem is that if you are going to be held liable for you use a wrong screw or you use a miss valve and somebody has the ability to change a valve, you wouldn't approve that either. And so most of the manufacturers in those space of either industrial, medical, or any other highly regulated market are reluctant to allow any control to anybody.
So the reason that I think that that fear is ludicrous and is complete lawyer paranoia is think about something like a catalytic converter in a car, right? It's illegal to run your car without a catalytic converter, like very illegal. You're going to jail kind of thing if you're caught doing it. Super easy to do. It takes a wrench and a screwdriver, and that's it to remove your catalytic converter. There's no requirement that those screws be epoxied down or use some sort of security head or anything like that, right? There's no requirement that automakers do anything to prevent the removal of the catalytic converter.
And one thing that I think is kind of
the
interesting
difference to that example, though, is you would see something has been tampered with. You cannot see the software has been tampered with unless it is open source. And so you can't necessarily verify a manufacturer's
assertion that car was running,
it was running fine before you touched it.
Sure, but then look at the Volkswagen situation, right? Volkswagen used the closed source, non-inspectable nature of its software. Actually, probably wasn't Volkswagen, it was probably Bosch, but that's neither here nor there, in order to hide a massive fraud on the government.
Yeah.
Which would not have happened had the software been open source.
Okay, so we're out of time, right? Yeah.
We're out of time.
We're out of time. Let me just wrap it up. Is there any sort of final question other than what's on here that anyone is dying to ask? Because I hate when someone leaves a room and they actually had... Yeah, quickly.
There was a question about mobile device security, and the FTC has a Start With Security program that they've been doing a road tour. They started here in San Francisco, and they have several handouts, including a specific one on mobile device security.
Oh, so that goes to the questions about are there any
Yeah,
available
is there anything
for
out there?
developers?
I'll have to check
We
that
are
out.
being
Yeah,
told to
I-
wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah, so that was a plug for the FTC's Start With Security program, which I've also heard good things about.
And since you had your hand up, let's just take the last question.
Okay. It appears that business is working under the strong assumption that the only thing they have to do is tell us that they're taking our data, they have a right to it, and so it's theirs. Is there something that we can reverse that? And the assumption is then that no, none of our data is available unless we tell them that they can use it.
I think it's basically just about you vote with your feet. You either
Yeah,
use
the problem is that right now we are telling them they can use it by purchasing their devices.
But right now we can't get a hold of a service. We can't buy even a product. I had somebody that bought a...
So, I mean, the answer
Anyway.
is yeah, but it would require a a significant change in the law. Given the climate in Congress, I find that rather unlikely.
Just a thought.
Yep. No, it'd be great. I would support that.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you, our panelists, for joining me in.
Thanks, Ken.